It started as any other ordinary evening, the kind that quietly passes without leaving much of a mark. My name is Ethan, an 18-year-old senior, navigating that delicate phase where childhood begins to blur into adulthood. My parents, strict yet caring, have always been the watchful sentinels of my life, their love intertwined with expectations and rules. Curfews were enforced with military precision, and family time was more obligation than bonding. Yet, in their eyes, these were necessary sacrifices to shape me into the man they believed I should be. But that's the kind of upbringing that sharpens secrets, and I carried a heavy one. To the world, I was an average teenager with a stable life and a steady boyfriend, Marcus. He was the kind of partner parents dreamed of for their child, polite, driven, with a dazzling smile that could disarm even the coldest soul. Yet, as perfect as Marcus seemed, there was a shadow in my life that refused to be eclipsed, my best friend, Caleb. Caleb and I had been inseparable since middle school. He was the embodiment of rebellion, with wild curls, and irreverent wit, and a knack for making the mundane feel extraordinary. He had a way of pulling me out of my comfort zone, challenging the safe little bubble I lived in. For years, I convinced myself that what I felt for him was the natural bond of a deep friendship. I ignored the flutter in my chest when he laughed at my jokes, or how my gaze lingered a moment too long on his lips when he spoke. The first crack in my carefully constructed life came on a Friday night, during one of our usual hangouts. Caleb and I had found solace in the woods near my house, a place where prying eyes couldn't reach and our conversations could roam free. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the trees in amber light, Caleb turned to me with an intensity that made my breath catch. "Ethan," he said, his voice softer than I'd ever heard it, "do you ever think about what it'd be like if things were different between us?" I froze, the question hanging in the air between us. My mind raced, searching for an escape route, but Caleb's gaze pinned me in place. For a moment, the world seemed to shrink until it was just the two of us, suspended in a fragile bubble of unspoken truths. What do you mean?" I stammered, though I knew exactly what he meant. "You know what I mean," he said, a faint smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "You felt it too, haven't you?" There it was, the truth I had buried for years, laid bare under the fading light of day. I wanted to deny it, to laugh it off as a joke, but the vulnerability in Caleb's eyes held me captive. Before I could think, my hand brushed against his, and the electricity of that simple touch sent a shiver down my spine. It happened so quickly I barely had time to process it. One moment we were sitting in silence, and the next his lips were on mine. The kiss was brief, tentative, and charged with every suppressed feeling we'd ever shared. When we pulled apart, I was met with a look of equal parts fear and hope in Caleb's eyes. "Sorry," he whispered, breaking the silence. "I shouldn't have." "No," I interrupted, my voice steadier than I expected. "Don't apologize." The words hung in the air, their weight sinking in. For the first time, I allowed myself to acknowledge the depth of my feelings for Caleb, and with that came a tidal wave of guilt. Marcus's face flashed in my mind, his trust, his kindness, and a pang of shame twisted in my gut. The ride home that night was a blur. Caleb had dropped me off a block away from my house, as we often did to avoid any unwanted questions. As I walked through the front door, my mother's sharp voice cut through the stillness. "You're late," she said, her eyes narrowing. "By 5 minutes," I replied, forcing a casual tone. "5 minutes is still late," she snapped. "Where were you?" "With Caleb," I said, the truth rolling off my tongue with practiced ease. My parents had always liked Caleb, despite his wild streak. To them, he was the charming friend who balanced out my quiet demeanor. If only they knew the truth about what had just happened in the woods. Dinner was a tense affair, my father rattling off his usual lecture about responsibility while my mother stole scrutinizing glances at me. I could feel the weight of my secret pressing down on me, threatening to spill over. When I finally escaped to my room, I locked the door and collapsed onto my bed, replaying the kiss over and over in my mind. The next morning, Caleb texted me. "Caleb, we need to talk." I stared at the screen, my heart pounding. A mix of anticipation and dread settled in my chest as I typed back a simple. When we met later that day, the tension was palpable. Caleb's usual confidence was replaced with uncertainty, his hands shoved deep into his pockets as he paced. "I don't want to mess up what you have with Marcus," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "You didn't," I lied. "Nothing's changed." But everything had changed. The following weeks were a whirlwind of stolen glances, whispered conversations, and meetings carefully planned to avoid suspicion. Each moment with Caleb felt like a lifeline, pulling me further away from the stable world I'd built with Marcus. The guilt gnawed at me constantly, yet I couldn't bring myself to stop. One evening, as Caleb and I sat in his car, parked at the edge of town, he turned to me with a look of quiet determination. "We can't keep doing this," he said. "I know," I replied, though the thought of ending whatever this was felt like tearing out a piece of my soul. But before we could discuss it further, my phone buzzed. A text from my mother. "Mom, where are you?" Panic set in as I realized how careless we had been. For the first time, I wondered how close we were to being discovered, and the thought sent a chill down my spine. As I stared at the screen, Caleb reached over and took my hand, his touch grounding me. "We'll figure it out," he said, his voice steady. But deep down, I knew that our time was running out. The days after our kiss blurred together, a hazy mix of stolen moments and simmering tension. Caleb and I had crossed an unspoken line, and there was no going back. Yet, for every surge of exhilaration that our secret brought, there was an equally heavy wave of guilt. It wrapped around me, pulling tighter with every lie I told Marcus, every evasion of my parents' increasingly suspicious questions. Despite this, I couldn't stay away from Caleb. We found excuses to meet wherever we could, behind the bleachers at school, in the quiet corner of the coffee shop downtown, or, more often, in the woods where it all began. Each time felt like both an escape and a gamble, the thrill of secrecy battling the ever-present fear of being discovered. One afternoon, as we sat side by side on a fallen log, Caleb turned to me with a smile that was equal parts playful and wistful. "Do you think they suspect anything?" he asked, his tone light but his eyes searching. "My parents?" I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. "They always suspect something. It's like they have this sixth sense for when I'm hiding something." "And Marcus?" The question hit harder than I expected. Marcus had been nothing but understanding during my increasingly erratic behavior. Missed dates, half-hearted conversations, and a vague, unconvincing explanation about being stressed with school. His patience only made my betrayal sting more. "He hasn't said anything," I admitted, my voice quieter now. "But I think he knows something's off." Caleb's smile faltered, replaced by a flicker of guilt. "We don't have to keep doing this, Ethan," he said, though his hand brushed mine as he spoke, betraying his words. "We can't stop," I replied, the honesty of the statement surprising even me. "I don't want to." That was the truth of it. As wrong as it was, as much as it complicated everything, I couldn't let go of Caleb. He was a storm that had swept into my life, leaving chaos in his wake, but I couldn't imagine life without him now. But the storm was starting to spill over, seeping into the carefully guarded walls of my life. One evening, as I walked through the front door, my mother met me in the hallway, her arms crossed and her expression stern. "Where have you been?" she demanded. "With Caleb," I said, forcing a casual tone. Her eyes narrowed. "You've been spending a lot of time with him lately. And you're always late. Is there something I should know?" "No, Mom," I said quickly, too quickly. Her gaze lingered on me for a moment longer before she sighed and walked away, but the unease in her expression lingered. Things came to a head the following weekend. Caleb and I had planned to meet at an old, abandoned shed on the outskirts of town, a place we knew would be completely private. The air was crisp and cool, the first signs of winter creeping into the late autumn landscape. Inside the shed, The world felt smaller, quieter, and for a little while, it was just us. We talked about everything and nothing, our voices soft in the stillness. But as Caleb leaned in, his lips inches from mine, a sound outside made us both freeze. Footsteps. My heart leaped into my throat as I turned toward the sound, my mind racing. Had someone followed us? Was it my parents? Marcus? The thought was enough to make my blood run cold. Caleb motioned for me to stay quiet, his expression tense as he moved toward the small, dirt-streaked window. He peeked outside, his body rigid. "It's just a dog," he whispered, relief flooding his voice. But the near miss left me shaken. The realization of how close we'd come to being discovered hit me like a punch to the gut. "We have to be more careful," I said as we left the shed, our breaths visible in the cold air. "We can't let this happen again." Caleb nodded, but I could see the flicker of defiance in his eyes. "You're worth the risk," he said simply. That night, lying in bed, I couldn't shake the memory of those footsteps, the raw fear that had gripped me. I stared at the ceiling, torn between the life I'd built and the life I was risking everything for. The next week brought another layer of tension. Marcus confronted me during lunch, his tone calm but his words cutting. "Ethan," he began, his eyes locked on mine. "What's going on? You've been distant, distracted. Are you? Is there someone else?" The question caught me off guard, and for a moment, I couldn't breathe. I wanted to tell him the truth, to lay everything bare, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, I shook my head, the lie slipping out before I could stop it. "No, Marcus. There's no one else." He studied me for a long moment, his expression unreadable, before he nodded. "Okay," he said, though the doubt in his voice was unmistakable. That conversation lingered in my mind as Caleb and I met again that evening, this time at a quiet overlook on the edge of town. The city lights stretched out before us, twinkling like stars. It was beautiful, serene, and yet the weight of my choices hung heavy in the air. "We can't keep doing this," I said finally, the words tasting bitter on my tongue. Caleb turned to me, his expression unreadable. "Why not?" "Because it's going to destroy everything," I said, my voice cracking. "My parents, Marcus, they're going to find out. And when they do, they'll hate me," he finished for me. "But not you. They could never hate you." His words, spoken with such quiet conviction, broke something inside me. I reached for his hand, gripping it tightly. "This isn't your fault, Caleb," I said. "It's mine too." As we sat there, hand in hand, I felt a strange mix of peace and dread. For now, we were safe, hidden from the world. But deep down, I knew the walls were closing in, and it was only a matter of time before everything came crashing down. It happened on a Sunday afternoon, a day that began so innocently that the storm it brought felt almost cruel. Caleb and I had grown reckless in our meetings, a combination of familiarity and desperation pushing us to take greater risks. That afternoon, we met in my room, a decision so bold it bordered on foolish. My parents were supposed to be out running errands, giving us what we thought was a safe window. The air in my room was thick with unspoken words as Caleb lounged on my bed, his hand brushing mine. His presence filled the space with a warmth that made the world outside feel far away. "You know we can't keep this up forever," I said, breaking the silence. My voice was soft, almost resigned. "I know," Caleb replied, his gaze meeting mine. "But I don't want to lose you." The weight of his words hung heavy in the room, and for a moment I forgot about everything else. My parents, Marcus, the consequences waiting just beyond the door. I leaned in, our foreheads touching, and in that small, stolen moment, it felt like we were the only two people in the world. Then the front door slammed. Panic shot through me like ice water as I scrambled away from Caleb. My mother's voice echoed through the house, sharp and unmistakable. "Ethan? Are you home?" My heart pounded in my chest as I turned to Caleb, who was already on his feet, his eyes wide with fear. "You need to hide," I whispered, motioning toward the closet. Without a word, Caleb slipped inside, closing the door just as my mother's footsteps neared. I barely had time to sit on the bed and compose myself before she appeared in the doorway, her eyes narrowing as she took in the scene. "Why is your door closed?" she asked, suspicion lacing her tone. "I was studying," I lied, my voice shaky. She scanned the room, her gaze lingering on the pile of clothes near the closet. "It's awfully quiet in here," she said, taking a step inside. I held my breath as she moved closer to the closet, her hand reaching for the doorknob. Time seemed to slow as a dozen excuses ran through my mind, none of them convincing enough to stop what was about to happen. Just as she began to turn the knob, my father called from downstairs. "Honey, can you help me with the groceries?" Her hand froze, and for a moment, I thought she might ignore him. But then she sighed and turned back to me. "We'll talk later," she said, her eyes narrowing before she left the room. As soon as I heard her footsteps retreat, I rushed to the closet, pulling the door open to find Caleb crouched inside, his face pale. "That was too close," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "You need to go," I said, my voice trembling. "If they come back?" He nodded, slipping out the window without another word. I watched him disappear into the backyard, my chest tight with a mix of relief and dread. But the reprieve didn't last long. The next day, as I sat at the dinner table, my parents confronted me. "Ethan," my father began, his tone measured but firm. "Is there something you need to tell us?" I froze, my fork hovering in midair. "What do you mean?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. My mother folded her arms, her expression stern. "We saw Caleb leaving yesterday. Through the window. Care to explain why he was sneaking out of your room?" Panic gripped me, and for a moment, I couldn't speak. I glanced between them, their expectant faces waiting for an explanation that I couldn't give. "We were just hanging out," I said weakly, knowing how unconvincing I sounded. "Hanging out?" my father repeated, his voice rising. "Do you think we're stupid, Ethan? What's going on with you too?" The words stuck in my throat, the weight of the truth too heavy to lift. My mother's gaze softened slightly, but her voice remained firm. "Ethan, we're your parents. Whatever it is, you can tell us." The room felt like it was closing in on me. I wanted to scream, to run, to deny everything. But when I opened my mouth, the truth slipped out in a voice barely above a whisper. "I love him." The silence that followed was deafening. My father's face turned red, his jaw clenched as he struggled to find the words. My mother looked stunned, her hands gripping the edge of the table as if it might anchor her to reality. "What about Marcus?" she asked, her voice breaking. "Does he know?" I shook my head, tears stinging my eyes. "No. And I hate myself for it." My father stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "This is unacceptable," he said, his voice shaking with anger. "You're throwing away everything for this?" "Harold, calm down," my mother said, though her voice wavered. She turned to me, her eyes filled with both disappointment and something softer, concern, perhaps, or fear. "I'm sorry," I said, my voice cracking. "I didn't mean for this to happen." But the damage was done. The fallout was swift and painful. My parents grounded me indefinitely, their trust in me shattered. I ended things with Marcus, confessing the truth and watching as his face crumbled with hurt. It was the hardest conversation I'd ever had, but I owed him that much. As for Caleb, our relationship became a casualty of the chaos. We stopped meeting, the risk too great, the weight of everything we'd lost too heavy to carry. In the weeks that followed, I found myself grappling with the consequences of my choices. I missed Caleb with an ache that felt physical, but I knew that what we had couldn't survive the firestorm we'd unleashed. One evening, as I sat alone in my room, my phone buzzed. A message from Caleb. "Caleb, I miss you." I stared at the screen, my heart aching with longing. But instead of replying, I set the phone down and stared out the window, the night sky stretching endlessly before me. I didn't know what the future held, but I knew one thing for certain: love, real love, is never easy. And sometimes, the hardest thing to do is let it go.